right, hello everybody, and welcome to Open Hour. I'm really excited for this month's Open Hour on lending libraries. And I know that we have a few people who are new here to Public Lab, and just for a little bit of information about Public Lab and about the Open Hour program, I'll give a brief introduction, and then essentially this will be sort of a loose time for us to all communicate and share ideas about lending libraries. I just want to check in with people who are on right now. Is the background noise distracting, or can you hear over that?
Okay, it's fine.
Okay, great. So for everybody who's new, Public Lab is a nonprofit environmental organization, and essentially Public Lab is a community of people who contribute to the idea and the Public Lab Wiki about open source environmental tools, technologies, and resources. And you know, we contribute in a lot of different ways online and on the wiki, and Open Hour is a time for us to come together and have some higher bandwidth discussions about things that we find important to the community or hot topics that we're passing around. So this month we're having the Open Hour on lending libraries. And the lending libraries discussion has been around for a while on Public Lab, and we had a conversation about it during our annual event in Cocodrie, Louisiana. And this is sort of an extension of that, looping in the idea of lending libraries and what lending libraries could look like in different situations, whether it's with Public Lab lending tools, some you know, more expensive technologies that aren't, you know, open source and accessible yet to people, or whether it's the idea of sharing out tools within your community. So this is an overall larger conversation about that, and I'm happy to, you know, let it go in whatever direction it runs. But just a little bit about Open Hour. So this is an hour-long discussion with people who are all over, and I'll do some introductions if people want to spend some time on that for a second while they're here. But just, you know, for the sake of the Open Hour, I will probably annoy everybody on here and refer our listeners to join us live on the live call and share out the live call link. So I'm sorry in advance if you find that frustrating, but I will plug in for people to loop in with us on the chat room, which is on the Open Hour page, or on the live call. Great. All right, I think that's it from me, and I think maybe if we'll go around and do some introductions. My name is Stevie Lewis, and I work with Public Lab as Outreach Manager, and maybe something that engages you or why you're here on this particular Open Hour. And for me, I think the concept of lending libraries is really important when we're talking about environmental tools and tool calibration. So I'm particularly interested in being able to share some of those tool resources that are inexpensive for community groups to have outside of the lending conversation. So that's kind of why I'm interested in the lending libraries idea. And I'll maybe pass it around this room and then pass it to everybody online. So, April?
I'm April Martin. I work for New Orleans Public Library. I am hoping I can offer the institutional perspective on you know, like logistics of lending items, and I'm also really curious about grassroots library systems because, you know, it's the alternative to what we have as a city system.
Great. Go ahead.
Sure. My name's Gretchen Zalkind, and I run the New Orleans Time Bank, which is a separate, and we've done some peer-to-peer lending through the Time Bank, but we're working at opening a tool library. So I'm really curious to hear what experience people have with that.
Great. And I'll maybe pass it off just in the order that you're up here on my my little Google page here. Miriam, would you like to go?
Sure. My name is Miriam Belpladia. I am with Waterworks, and so we focus on water quality and flood mitigation, and I'm really interested in the idea of a tool library, and then also we've been in very early stages of being interested in looking into options for doing lab analyses locally. This came out of a conversation that we had earlier in the fall, in which there's really a need to have sort of local accredited labs So yeah, I'm interested in sort of maybe how these discussions can intersect.
Great. And Liz, I have you next. Are you muted?
Yes, I was muted and on video mute. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, I've been running an informal version of a lending library here in New York. There's quite a vigorous exchange market going of people picking up tools from my lab and going out to do field work with them, and then before they even have time to return them, some other community member wants them, so they get handed around quite organically. And we've been doing all that coordination on our local mailing list. So I feel like that's been successful. I'm also very excited about scaling it up, so I'm super into this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'm gonna mispronounce your name, I'm sure. Jana? Is that correct? Jay, I think you're on mute. If you want to unmute and Jay. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, I'm Yanina.
Hello. How do you say your name again?
Yanina.
Yanina. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm calling in from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I work at the Harvard Graduate School of Design as a librarian, and I'm interested in knowing more about the logistics of lending and some of the experiences of other people on the call here.
Thank you. Bronwyn?
Hi, yeah, I am a librarian in CUNY at New York. I've been involved with the public lab for a while. I'm sorry, I've got laryngitis, so it might be a little hard to hear. But yeah, I guess I'm really interested in ways that libraries can participate with the public lab and sort of mutually beneficial relationships that you know, where everybody wins. So trying to figure out what things that the public lab has to gain by sort of building relationships with sort of more institutional research organizations, and you know, how those of us in these institutional libraries can sort of benefit and serve our users with public lab tools. So.
Great. Thanks, Bronwyn. And just I noticed we have some viewers on here. Feel free to ping in questions if you join us on the chat page on publiclab.org/wiki/OpenHour. There's a chat page and a link to join us on the live call. So I have a list of prompt questions, but if anybody has anything that they'd like to get started or that they've been thinking about under this topic, feel free to kick off or jump in at any time. Does anybody want to start, or should? Okay, I kind of figured that's fine. So one of my first question is, when thinking about lending libraries in general, what is the most important aspect? Is it, you know, space, structure, partners, outreach? What is it that makes the biggest secure of a successful lending library program? Anybody have thoughts?
I know for me, at least with the public lab tools, it's really useful that tools can be available when people have a need for them. You know, I think that one of the things that's really great about having Liz in our collection here is that, you know, somebody can sort of put an email out on Thursday and pick something up on Friday, go do their work over the weekend, in a way that I think that sort of momentum gets lost if you have to sort of schedule things weeks in advance, or kind of wait for somebody's schedule to kind of permit a meetup or something like that. So I think sort of consistency is a really important feature of something like this.
So I've also heard here, just both from you and Liz, about access, I think, and the idea that this is sort of maybe an informal structure right now. And in terms of scaling it, what do you think would be maybe the biggest, how do I say this? Like what would help move that forward in scaling it?
That's interesting. I mean, we were working a little bit. We sort of put out a very quick and dirty proposal for the Knight Foundation Library challenge, where we were kind of getting our ideas together about that. But you know, I think being sort of I think some of the obstacles to scaling are simply that we're not in all places at all times, and not all of us sort of have the time or the interest or the skills to sort of be the person who has the kite camera rigs all set up, and also be the person who teaches somebody how to use it, and also be the person who talks to them about what to do with the stuff once they've found it. Whereas, you know, I think libraries sort of are great in that this kind of already a nexus of sort of interdisciplinary research. So there are a lot of tools already kind of located together in one space. And I think the challenge is, and I'm sorry I don't remember your name, but sort of finding ways to kind of mesh the public lab, which is, you know, mostly volunteers and a little bit freeform and very much based on people's own sort of ability to contribute, with sort of what libraries that are part of institutions and part of bureaucratic systems are going to be able to work with and sustain. And I think some of that is just sort of having conversations and making sure that everybody's speaking the same language.
Does anybody else have thoughts on what's most important, or maybe how to address some of the issues of space, structure, partners, or outreach?
Can I ask a question for Liz?
Sure.
I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about your experience working in the lab, and so how the relationship is between the tools you all have there and how that works in terms of lending them out.
Sure. It really has been informal. I have a large cabinet with some spare kits of all the kinds of kits that Public Lab currently has. And also some prototypes that aren't really fully ready to go out in the field yet, but that people come in and they work on and generally can store with me. So you can also check out development type gear. I think scaling to me, well, does that answer your question? Do you want to ask another specific question about anything?
I guess I'm curious about, is it the public lab community then that is tapping into, how do you get the word out that those kits are available? And what's the relationship between your lab and how the public feels comfortable to come in and take those kits out?
Oh, interesting. Well, I have to say it's largely been people who are already connected with Public Lab who know they can come and get these kits. And being connected with Public Lab means they're in the network where information is flowing through the email groups, and they understand that the full documentation of the parts that go in the kit and how to put it together and where to get your own later is all on the website. So I'm making zero assertions that the public is finding the tools. I'm also making zero assertions that if the tools were somehow more public, that they would be useful outside the context of being connected with the rest of Public Lab infrastructure. I would like to add that we are getting requests from people in areas without staff or even organizers to want to have this gear, and we're not sure how to handle it. And there's also this question that, and I think some other people can talk more about it, so I'll just reference the idea that Stevie opened, that there's some calibrated kinds of equipment. There's some other kinds of equipment that not everyone is going to have, and that perhaps could get mailed back to a central location. So this idea that there's a local in-person handoff and maybe a storage hub, but then there might also be a bulk mail distribution to cover a broad area And without needing to set up local hubs, it's just mailboxes back and forth, back and forth.
Very cool.
Liz, I want to ask, because what you were saying kind of led to one of my questions about this. As far as public use would go, do you, because yours is an informal, already established library, do you have a way of vetting users, maybe even training them, or is it that the folks that you currently lend to, because they were already with Public Lab, just already knew how to use the equipment?
You know, that's a subtlety that has been kind of obscure in Public Lab in the past. The training idea, because what no one's arguing with is that people learn. People are somehow learning from being in contact with Public Lab. However, we've been very vague about having, I mean, we're beyond informal. We're having this tacit learning coming just through the experience of being near someone who knows it and like kind of watching and kind of getting their hands on it and like they kind of learn. But we have been extremely undefined about how learning is happening. And to some extent resistant to it, although we're always trying to think about it. And we don't, I think there's a community-wide preference that we don't want to like certify and have experts, because there's a sense that we want this knowledge to be like part of civic life almost, if unless that's too self-indulgent of us to say. But without that, and if Public Lab's going to grow and become more accessible, and we're trying to send these tools around, you know, I also have that question of how can we be more explicit about the types of learning required so that people can use them? I'd love to hear your opinions on that, because I'm not in that world directly.
I don't know. I would say Stevie does training here, and they're as public programs like what the way we have worked together is that she's hosted trainings and is about to host another training at the library using our space, which brings in people that she's already connected with, but also the potential to bring in folks that are just curious about what's going on and what Public Lab is doing, and what kind of equipment they use and how it's used and that sort of thing. But I don't know, it just seems like with a lending library you would have to in some way know that, first of all, the things are being used and how they're being used, and just some sort of, I don't know, guarantee, because it's not like a $10 book that you're loaning out to people, you know what I mean? So, but in order for it to grow, I don't know, somebody would have to show expertise and be willing to show others, share the knowledge.
I kind of wonder if part of it is, like, the idea of Public Lab has to do a lot with experimentation and flexibility. And maybe, because I know Liz hosts events that are very similar to ones that I host, and whether or not we call it a training or if we call it like hacking or, I think different people come and people will feel differently about what it is that they're doing. Okay. But I don't know. But that's like what Liz is saying. Everybody does walk away having learned something.
Right.
So, and I don't know if it's about sort of collaboratively doing these things together, and maybe it is, or just actually getting your hands on something and feeling more, like you know more about it by the end of your experience. Hijack that one. So, I think there's something, when we talk about borrowing from a library and, books or audio books or videos or things, even like computers, a lot of times that is we expect people to know how to use them, and that's a little bit about what we're discussing. I think that I'm kind of wondering, I guess, you know, does a space like this where you're lending out a tool that has a certain way you use it or would use it require somebody to be associated with it as that person? Or is it an opportunity to sort of embellish on our online material to say, oh, you've checked out this item, you know, here's things people have done with it in the past. And I'm kind of wondering, does anybody have thoughts on, you know, the in-person experience that is maybe scenario one versus, you know, the other situation where maybe you don't have somebody in the room with you?
I'm just thinking, I mean, I know that, you know, from my perspective being in the library, you know, if we were going to kind of have a project like this, it would have more feet within an institution if there was some sort of understanding or some participation on our part. You know, if somebody just delivered a box of stuff and, you know, wanted us to be a hub to loan stuff out, that's great until it breaks or people have questions, and then, you know, then our usefulness is sort of over with. But I think that when sort of the libraries themselves, whether they're people or hubs or smaller chapters or actual libraries or schools, you know, if to whatever degree they can sort of serve as collaborators and not just sort of receivers of stuff, I think that's sort of what gets the stuff to kind of move from being a pilot project to being something that's actually part of services that the place will offer.
So I noticed we have a few joiners on here. Let's see, Jeff, Will, and Kate. You want to say hello and introduce yourself a little bit about why you're interested in this conversation?
Like far away from the thing. Yeah, I mean, we're based in Somerville, and we are like sort of a hub for public lab tools, and are also in the process of starting a tool library, not specifically for public lab, but just for circulating tools. Our experience has been that like simply hosting tools is fine for the people who already, or seems to be fine for the people who are already aware of A, their existence, and like B, what they might do with them. So like for instance, Don borrows our tools with some regularity. The people who are not already public lab organizers who tend to borrow the stuff that's currently like sitting at Press and Crafts tend to be people that organizers have connected with, and organizers with whom organizers are bottom lining projects. So our hope is that in hosting public lab tools as part of a wider, our hope is that like a tool library, and specifically having a tool librarian, like functions as an outreach method to be able to get more people to develop the literacy to be able to use them. And I think, I mean, my own personal position is that people will default to not using the things that you have if they don't know how to use them, and that the way that you get them to use them is to have a person who is both willing to teach them and like willing to regularly host trainings. And for the tool library, one of the big requests that we've gotten has not actually been for tools, but for tool trainings. So not just for public lab stuff, but for
other power tools.
Right. And just for those of us who are maybe new to the public lab community on here, when we're mentioning organizers, we mean people who are within the public lab community and maybe a higher level, that they are recognized by the community as people who organize for, you know, some of our Google groups, do a lot of work on the wikis, just people who are really involved in a lot of everything that's going on within public lab. So there are about 50 or 60 or so specific people around the world who are public lab organizers. And that's who we're mentioning when we say organizers. So, Ron, I noticed you joined us as well. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself and what brings you here? I'm putting you on the spot. I'm sorry. I don't need to do that. All right, that's fine. I do like your duckies, though. They're very cute. So I guess another question that I have is, in terms of people getting their hands on these, what does it actually look like when a successful program is set up? So we've talked about, having maybe somebody there who could facilitate trainings, but what else makes for a successful program? What other things need to be in place to ensure that the word is getting out and that you're getting your supplies back? What else is needed other than potentially the person who can do these trainings?
Well, I think on a very practical level, one thing that you need is sort of time and a little bit of funding, because if you're sort of partnering with the public lab as a library, but you don't have a staff person who has the ability to sort of work trainings into their schedule, then you need to rely on sort of outside people or stuff like that. And I think just keeping things maintained, being able to sort of check things in and check things out. It's a time commitment, and I think that finding places or people that have the ability to offer that is, not everybody can, and I think just because a library or school or wherever has a box of public lab tools, it doesn't always mean that they sort of have the flexibility or the time built into their schedule to really kind of commit to working with them. And so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, for public lab stuff, but also other things, is sort of how to make institutions understand that this kind of research is important and meaningful and maybe part of their missions. So I may have been a tangent, but.
No, I think that's a really great point, Bronwyn. I want to keep on the table what you said about making institutions aware of the importance of the mission, and support what you just said, that there are institutions right now that have piles of public lab tools on shelves. It's I'm commonly hearing it from universities, and the big issue is that a bunch of tools will get purchased for an educational use, and Public Lab, the nonprofit, is making a lot of bulk deals to educational institutions right now. And through our own professional networks, we're hearing that there's a lot of university-level classes using Public Lab tools. And there's always the idea that this is an institutional purchase and it's going to support Public Lab work in the area, but there really aren't connections back to like the living community of where the meaning comes from, like doing environmental investigations and reporting back and sharing results. So far, institutional stockpiles of tools have really been dead ends that haven't resulted in much contribution back or really any outcomes.
Yeah, sorry, I thought that Will wanted to say something. One of the things that was really effective for us, and I think I said this a couple of times in a couple of different contexts, so sorry if I'm repeating, the initial round of aerial mapping workshops that ran was a phenomenal kind of tool outreach platform, and I know the mapping kits have been the primary tool that has gotten circulated and that has kind of made its way out into the world in, I think, a really sustainable way. And I think one of the things that would be, I think there is a lot of energy and within the organizer community, for example, for doing that kind of dedicated outreach. I think there are a lot of people who currently do that kind of dedicated outreach with whatever tool they happen to use. whether it's the COKI, whether it's the spectrometer, whether it's mapping. And one of the things that I think was really effective in like 2010 that would be incredibly easy to kind of put into use now is kind of a similar push in the same way that there were mapping workshops everywhere. There were like multiple mapping workshops happening. Like you could go to a mapping workshop. It was like there weren't like 20 different tools that you could pick from. There was one, and you could go, and it was really easy to go and get trained on how to fly a kite and attach a camera to the kite. And one of the things that I think would be a really powerful use for the organizer community would be to, pick 3 tools that we want to do something similar with. To run another community-wide drive around aerial mapping, but then to run a community-wide drive around the spectrometer, or to run a community-wide drive around the riffle, which would have the kind of twin benefit of like training organizers on how to do trainings, but would also make it really, really clear that like these are tools. I know not all of them are like done or finally tested, but like these are tools that you can use right now. They're tools that are good enough for distribution. They're tools that there's a sample set of things that you can do with these tools, and we're gonna, for like 2 months, we're gonna run as many trainings as we can in as many cities as we can to teach people how to use these tools. And I think that is the basis for a tool library, like a community-based tool library, is really powerful, because then it's really like people who want to like start nodes. It's really obvious like what they need to acquire, and it's really obvious what they can do. And right now that knowledge exists within the organizer community. It exists around whatever tools people happen to be using and developing. But there's a lot of that's a much smaller sphere. And I think that doing the kind of drive that Public Lab did a couple of years ago around balloon mapping would be really effective, and would probably also kind of reorient. And I get the sense that that's happening in New Orleans around the water quality stuff. I think that would help to redirect energy around specific tools that allows people to kind of figure out what the baseline is that they can do. And the tools are far enough along that we can do that. That would be a thing I would be really excited to see and help create.
I would totally support that. I think that's a lot of food for thought there, Katie. I feel really supportive of how you described that, the situation.
One of the questions that's come up here in the sidebar is, we're talking a bit about mapping, and specifically the mapping tool, and what it was like to do that in high volume. Was actually the question of some of the costs that's associated with this, and how to handle costs. And I think that's a great question to bring up, because when we're talking about the mapping kits, there are several ways that we've defined to do DIY aerial mapping, and one of the most popular ways is through balloon mapping. But there's also kites and poles and things like that. But with balloon mapping comes the cost of helium, which is only increasing exponentially. And I guess I'm wondering is, as this isn't going to be our only example of a tool that has an associated cost with use, I'm sure, as we go into the future. And how, as a lending library, can we support, exploration when there is actually associated costs with the materials that we're using?
Yeah, helium is just really tricky. I feel like you find your helium supplier, and then you have your helium supplier, and you hope that they don't go away. And whoever happens to have the helium supplier is like whoever bought it. Like we didn't have helium for a long time. Nobody would sell it to us, and then we like found someone who would lease us a a giant tank, and we're never giving the tank back. every month we pay them $6 because we know we're never going to find helium anywhere else.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. It's like your dealer. It's like your hookup.
Yeah, great.
I mean, the helium is an outstanding problem, but there's some other types of gear that we do expect people to have, or that, let's say, one of the toolkits would rely on someone's personal gear or them getting other gear. And in terms of that kind of gear, that's mostly cameras and like old cameras. Old in quotes. It's just earlier versions of digital cameras from like maybe 3 to 5 to 10 years ago. And I mean that's actually part of our design process, is to design to take advantage of the excesses of the consumer market and stuff that has gone, high quality stuff that's obsolete for being a consumer widget, but that like with some other wingdings on it can be an environmental research tool. So, but maybe we could explain that better.
Yeah, and I think that helium is a consumable, and it's the only consumable among the public lab tools that I can think of off the top of my head. Which makes it unique. But I actually think that all consumables will probably be unique, and there isn't like a generalized answer to how you would deal with that.
Yeah. But I'm also thinking, for example, Miriam, in your conversation and potentially developing a lab and having lab resources available, sometimes, especially when we're talking about, for example, with Public Lab, the oil testing kit, to run and work with the oil testing kit is just a flat cost, essentially, other than, you'll pay for your sample bottles and your mineral oil. It's not going to be a cost too much above what you're initially putting out for the kit. Mm-hmm. But, if you were to consider the lending library as well to be the place where you could actually run the samples of that oil to say, yes, I brought it past the public lab test, and now I also want to, do this as well. And if that's what is part of the lending library, is that extra tool. I was just talking to a group down in Florida that's saying they spent $2,000 per sample being run for oil testing. Exorbitant cost. And maybe if they had the equipment available, the cost would be less. And this is the same thing that we're seeing in the Wisconsin sand issue, the sand frac mining, is that the equipment itself that they have been using is a $10,000 piece of equipment, which they raised the money for, and now they have the use of it. But to run the samples, the actual pads that collect the dust is, similarly like, several $1,000s or $1,000 or something. That anyway, associated cost with this equipment that is, not public lab equipment, but might be associated with a lending library situation. And I was wondering if anybody has thoughts about that, and about how maybe some of those costs could be met within the system, or if it has to be external. Does anybody have thoughts on that? Miriam, what?
Oh, there you go.
No, go for it, Bronwyn.
I think at the barn raising, there were some conversations about just in general ways to support sort of research projects and organizers, and I think people were throwing around the idea of sort of thinking a little bit more about things like mini grants. Even when it's not necessarily just the helium that's expensive, but maybe it's transportation to a site to keep on going with a sustained project, or whether whatever your costs are, even if they're not strictly kind of tool related, and I think that sometimes something like a little bit of a grant makes your project a little bit official in a way that encourages sort of buy-in and sort of continuing engagement, and I know that we have a little bit of a grant thing for organizers and activities, but I wonder if we might think about sort of trying to make something like that available for actual projects. especially in places where there's less of a public lab infrastructure to rely on.
I think, so we were looking, there's a conversation that we had, a workshop back at Propeller in October, in which we were looking at monitoring local water challenges. And so, there we had folks from like Pontchartrain Basin Foundation, from Sewage and Water Board, from the city, from the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority that are doing various kinds of environmental monitoring, but they were discussing sort of the difficulty in, one, the fact that needing more labs in the Greater New Orleans area to do the bacteria analysis and LELAP accredited labs, and dealing with that issue of sort of the biological timeframes. But yeah, the idea of like the largest expense being the equipment, and then I think also the fact that there would be the need for sort of more continuous monitoring that they're not capable right now of doing, both from like a cost perspective and personnel perspective. And so, they have not been relying on volunteer monitoring for the most part. There's some of that happening with some of the New Orleans redevelopment lots, but I think I'm interested in this idea of, are there ways in which we can make lab space available that could, both be certified to handle some of the testing that these agencies are needing to do locally, but then also would that be sort of a hub that could make tools and support available to folks that are doing citizen monitoring. So that was kind of the perspective we were coming at it. I mean, it's still very, I'm interested to join this conversation because, yeah, I think that we're still very early in our thinking on it, but that was sort of the place we were coming at from. I'm interested to hear a bit from Gretchen, maybe, about how, I mean, I know the Time Bank, y'all have done a lot in terms of setting up that infrastructure, and I'm interested to hear what you're looking at in terms of the tool lending library.
Well, it's still in process. With regular tools, the good news is that there are so many existing tool libraries that we don't need to create things. There's tool library and software that's been developed out of the tool libraries in Seattle and in Portland, Oregon. So the one from Seattle is called Local Tools. People use it for like hand tools, building type tools, but also for like kitchen tools. And you can have, you basically can track anything. We pick the Local Tools because it supports multiple locations. You can branches of your tool libraries, and people can go on and reserve items. That said, we haven't actually started using it. We selected it, and we're our stumbling block is a location right now. There's a Google group for tool libraries, a National Tool Library Google group, which is a great organization, and the tool libraries from, Berkeley has had their tool library since 1979 as part of the public library. Oakland's tool library is part of the public library, but also West Philly, Seattle, Portland. I mean, there are these tool libraries that have been around for years, and it's a group that will willingly share information about how they deal with consumables. What's their budget for consumables? Their membership situation. So we have lots of information. We think we have a pretty good roadmap, but we're still dealing with the location. Where the people are, the real estate's too expensive. So we could get a location, but there'd be no people around, so we're still working it out.
That's definitely something that I face here in New Orleans area as well. It's, having access to like we have a small, sort of like similarly to what Liz has in New York, is Like you walk into the public lab office of Propeller and there's just like a wall of stuff, but that's like essentially it. And people will come all the time and be like, can I leave my public lab equipment here with you? And I'm like, I still have to sit at a desk, So space is a huge issue. And I wonder about, Liz, you mentioned sometimes that your tools will hop from group to group based on who's using them. And is there risk with that and a benefit, because maybe these people are meeting each other as well, people who were formerly using a tool, giving it off to somebody who's looking for a tool. And could that potentially take care of some of the space question? Like you own it not own it, but you have it until somebody else requests it and then you arrange a time? I don't know, would that work?
It has been working in New York, and I heard from Jeff that it works up in Somerville. Katie, does it happen that people hand the tools off directly to each other and they never come back, or they don't come back immediately to parts and crafts every time?
They're not necessarily solely based on parts and crafts. It's mostly the kite mapping stuff, but they hop from place to place, but it's a small enough community that pretty much if you can look on the list and be like, who has these now? Oh, okay.
Right. Yes, last week Don showed up at my door and I gave him Jeff's kite.
Right, yeah.
To go to a mapping somewhere, but
sort of like a lending library.
Right, but it's very, very socially.
It's also sort of like you left your stuff at your friend's house. And
okay, sort of like leaving your stuff at your friend's house.
Yeah, so it's a functional system.
But the problem with an informal system.
How do you track who has what?
Well, it's all on the mailing list. This happened in New York a lot. I don't know, last summer, there was gear and Bronwyn, I'm gonna mention you in this in a positive way, but there was a cycle that gear went from, and I don't remember the exact order, but it was it circulated around Brooklyn, out to the beach and to the Gowanus through 3 different people, and then it got handed off directly from Gowanus researchers to Ann Chen, who was boarding a plane later that night to go to Canada. And when that equipment came back, it still didn't come back to me. And so in that way, do we need space for a tool library, or is it so distributed that it just floats?
Well, I love the vision of the world in which everybody who might ever borrow a tool is a close personal friend of mine, but I think it's potentially not the most inclusive. And I love that vision of the public lab community, but I think it's potentially, by many standard definitions, not an inclusive framing. Yeah. There are lots of people there are lots of people who might use the public lab tools in Somerville who have no idea that we have them, because they don't happen to be not even because they don't happen to be in the public lab community, but because they don't happen to be on the right mailing list. And that's the thing that we're working on to try to rectify that.
That's an outreach question.
But it's also a thing that we're not really.
It is related, but
right now all the requests formally now.
Yeah. Also, I think that I actually like it when it happens on the local mailing lists, because why are the mailing lists there? For a lot of people who don't know that you can just say, hey, does anyone have a kit I can borrow of any kind? Then just that traffic is sort of like a periodic reminder that that it's cool to just ask for that. And then sometimes when I have some equipment that I can lend out, I'll wait a little bit just to see if someone else will offer it up, because then it's one random person on the list will meet some other random person on the list, and then they'll get to know each other. And that's happened. I think Lynn Wolbast from East Providence was mapping the metal recycling plant, asked for a kite, and got not just a kite, but a person who knew how to fly it to come out at 8 in the morning in the freezing cold to actually map the plant. So that was a nice bit of laziness on my part.
That was such strategic laziness, Jeff. You should get more credit for laziness like that.
I want credit on that map. Authorship credit.
In this last couple of parts of this conversation, we have somewhat conflated informality and distributedness. And of course, it is entirely possible to have an entirely distributed and a very formal tool library where there's a very formal registration process, but things are still stored at other people's houses.
Yeah.
That's a cool point.
Yeah, I love that idea. What does that look like? Because using the Google Groups, I don't know. I'm just thinking, for example, down here in New Orleans, I use the Google Groups from everything from crockpots for the barn raising to, you know, can we put somebody up for the night, you know? And it is informal, and it is also really useful and successful in that way. But I've also felt like there have probably been situations where stuff has fallen through the cracks, and you know, now somebody who isn't following on that group as much, you know, maybe has a piece of equipment that, you know, people are wanting to use within the community. And a great example of that is, you know, somebody who had one of the helium tanks, and you know, now it's harder to get in touch with them, or we're not sure who it was handed off to, and so. I love the informal system idea. How can it maybe work in a more structured way where we can account for some of these tools that are dispersed?
I'd also like to add that while the informal system where everyone is kind of responsible for housing equipment is a great idea, you would still need to have a hub of some, at least of some size, because there are always going to be people don't have the space to hold on to things, or like what you're saying in your office, where people want to just drop off their things from, you know, you're the hub.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's because they either can't keep up with it or don't have the space to keep up with it. There's no way to eliminate those people from your group, so you have to.
That's true. Space shouldn't be something that excludes someone from a lending program.
Right.
Yeah.
Although it is a really great idea that
Yeah.
every, you know, part of being part of the group, knowing that you may be holding on to things until somebody needs them next, and being accountable for that, you know, because it spreads out the responsibility.
Right. Great.
I don't know. The time bank, you know, you're basically dealing with two databases, one of your members and one of the assets, and how they work together. So I think the tool library softwares too. It's like, these are your members, these are your assets. But it is fairly time intensive to maintain these databases. But the frameworks, the infrastructure is out there. It's just work.
And that's a great, I'd love to, at some point before the end of the call, segue into compiling resources that people can look into for maybe examples of successful lending programs, or like exactly what you're saying, the local tools, just resources people can look into and referencing, you know, what is out there to help with lending programs. And we don't have to do that now, but maybe before the end of the call we could collect a pile of those resources, and I can post them on the OpenHour page. And you can email them to me, or we can share them, you know, online here, but or post them on the OpenHour page, or I can help you do that.
Well, it's almost 2 o'clock right now. So, I mean, on that, I don't mind just talking about the topic, which is so FarmHack is another open source community with a lot of different members spread out over, you know, far away from each other. And they have a bunch of gear, and they're trying to get their database model for, you know, who's got what where. And I want to bring this up, is like, it's something we could actually work on together with them, like potentially. Like, get 2 open source communities developing together, versus like just use someone else's system, or do our own only system for us, or something like that.
Yeah.
Liz, RJ is here. I was pointing back at him.
Oh, hey RJ. You know, I have a friend and weird FarmHack person known as Devin. Yeah, he's.
Liz, you know these calls are recorded, right?
Well, this is a continual problem in my life.
By your friend, not about FarmHack.
This is familiar, actually.
This always happens to me. So, no, there's a guy here from FarmHack whose name is Devin that is like, who really wants to have Public Lab and FarmHack work together, and really wants to talk to you, RJ, about that.
Cool. We do our weekly organizers calls at Thursday nights at 7 p.m. And I think he's been on it. But if he doesn't know about it, I'm sure he knows about it. But on the tool lending topic, just my input is, yeah, we have some brainstorms around tool lending on the FarmHack site. There was an event up in Burlington, Vermont, where we did some brainstorming around it, but we don't have any, like, there's a lot of legal issues for farming tools because they're often large implements, and so there might actually be some differences between the implements that Public Lab is looking to share and the ones that FarmHack is sharing, but I could be wrong. I wonder what the problem might just be, like, people knowing that something is available to be shared. And there is a lot of interesting examples out there of how other communities have solved that problem. There's like this underutilized resource. How do you make it utilized? Is often the problem. Like I have a kite kit in my closet, or not a kite kit, a balloon kit from Public Lab, and I've used it like twice, and there may have been other people who wanted it but didn't know where to ask. Didn't know that I was the person to ask, maybe, or maybe they didn't know that the listserv was where they should ask. So, anyways, I think that's an interesting problem and something that the community, we all have an interest in helping sort of lubricate that utilization of unused resources. So that's my thought.
I think that's a great way to frame this issue, and it reminds me that a project that folks have been scheming up for Public Lab, the idea that on profile pages you can see who has what gear, you know, and if you could see who's on a map at whatever level of geographic privacy is appropriate, you could kind of see who's got what where in a way that might help at least this sort of distributed lending library to work.
For example, I would definitely list my balloon kit on there, and then the question is like, is that going to be useful for people to go to me directly, or is it going to be more awkward and just like something that people don't know about? Maybe they just end up asking the listserv anyways. Maybe the reason things are underutilized is because
that'd be fine.
People don't know where to ask. So if the problem is people don't know where to ask, then it's just a matter of communicating where to ask, and the listserv might also still be a good resource for that. So I don't know what the problem, what the problem in optimizing utilization is, but maybe the answer is like we don't know until we try things, and when we try things and suddenly we see utilization like suddenly increase, then maybe we kind of figured out like what the problem was.
Sorry, I don't mean to be shuffling around here. We have a group coming in this room on the hour, so I'm just trying to move around a little bit. Great, thanks everybody. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that? I don't need to close this out, but I'm going to have to shuffle rooms here. So if anybody has anything further that they'd like to share on that topic or something else while we wrap up the call.
I got to sign out too. Stevie, where do you want us to send links? Directly to you, or should we post on the page?
Either you're comfortable with is great.
Okay.
you can send me an email at stevie@publiclab.org, and I can post for everybody, or just edit on the OpenHour page.
Okay.
And right below, so it'll probably take me 20 minutes after the call, but I will post this call below as to the ones that have already happened, and then you can just right below that, add in your links or ideas. And we should also talk a little bit about maybe next steps with some of these ideas as well. So we can loop in there, or email out to the big Public Lab group about some of these ideas.
Cool. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Stevie.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your time, and I really enjoyed it. It was a great call, and I look forward to next month's OpenHour is going to be on engaging in citizen science, and it's going to be a evening call for us on in the U.S. and Eastern Time. So look for us then, and there'll be more information. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Stevie.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.